Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my podcast. Today, my information is going to be based on the award winning book that I just finished reading called Maniac Magee. We're going to be talking about the journey of the main character throughout the story and also his development as he goes through his journey. Just a little bit about the main character before we start. The main character's name is Jeffrey Lionel Magee. He's a young boy from Pennsylvania in the United States. And this story in particular takes place in the 1960s. Just on a side note, in the 1960s, racism and segregation were very prevalent in the United States. And this is an important topic in our story, but we'll get to that later as we explain what the situation is within the town that he's in. Jeffrey Lionel Magee starts his life off in this book in unfortunate circumstances. We hear that his parents died when he was only 3 years old in a tragic trolley accident, and then he was shipped off to live with his Aunt Dot and Uncle Dan for the remainder of his life. Although this doesn't go necessarily as planned, as after a while, Maniac can't handle life at his aunt and uncle's house due to the fact that they are not divorced, but they are living separately in the same house due to the fact that they were very strict Catholics and did not believe in divorce. After he was done with this situation and couldn't handle it anymore, Jeffrey decides to run away. We'll explain the Maniac moniker later. After what they call it, a year of running, we find ourselves settled in the town of Two Mills, Pennsylvania. So Two Mills is a small town in the middle of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is more northern state than a southern state, but in the 1960s, the southern states tend to be very heavily racialized. And for this example, Two Mills is considered a racist community as it's divided in two. The east side for the blacks and the west side for the whites. This is a very interesting situation as we find out that our main character, Jeffrey, really doesn't understand the meaning of racism. He grew up in a middle-class family, therefore he was more sheltered from this information throughout his life, and he didn't really understand what it meant until he arrived in Two Mills. When Jeffrey arrives in Two Mills, he meets a young girl in the east side of town named Amanda Beale. After talking with Amanda for a little bit, she seems kind of confused as Jeffrey's a white boy in the east side of town, and normally the black stayed on their side of the town and the white stayed on their side of the town. It was a segregation kind of thing, and more that the whites had control over the community than that the blacks and whites never mixed. But continuing on, Amanda continues a conversation with Jeffrey before she goes to school, and she mentions that she is into reading. She also carries around a suitcase full of books, which is very interesting to Jeffrey as he enjoys reading as well. Right before Amanda heads off to school, she agrees to give Jeffrey one of her books to read. And it's interesting which one she gives him, which is The Children's Crusade, which had a lot about, which I researched a little bit. And The Children's Crusade is actually a book about race. And it talks about a lot of different cultures and race and religion. And it's just interesting due to how many injustices we see within this story. And for her to give him a book on injustice is just kind of cliche towards the topic, and I found that kind of interesting. But anyway, moving on. Later on in the story, Jeffrey becomes a member of the Beale family as he develops a very close relationship with Amanda, and then the Beales take him in as almost a foster child, as Jeffrey has been an orphan since he ran away from his aunt and uncles. At this point in the book, Jeffrey's becoming a role model for those in the community, especially Amanda's younger siblings within that Beale household. Jeffrey participates in various different chores throughout the house, such as dishwashing, putting the garbage out, mowing the lawn, walking the dog. He does all of that without being asked, because in the story, Jeffrey is so concerned about finding a family that he doesn't care about anything else, and he will do anything just as long as he feels like he belongs. So later on in this part of the story, Jeffrey starts to receive racial criticism from other members of the black community. And it's interesting because normally it wouldn't be a problem, and the Beals support him 100%. They don't find any problems in Jeffrey at all, but for some reason, some members of the community don't find him particularly they don't particularly accept him within their community. So after the Beal family starts being threatened about him being there, he decides to leave and sacrifice essentially what he loves and what he cares for to protect the ones that he loves. And he sacrificed that connection in exchange for the Beals being okay and not having to take any backlash for him being there. So as part 2 of this book continues, Jeffrey is once again homeless, and we find him sleeping in the local zoo within the buffalo shelter. A couple hours later in the morning, the groundskeeper for the zoo finds Jeffrey sleeping in the buffalo enclosure. This is kind of an interesting situation because the groundskeeper is actually an uneducated man named Grayson, and Jeffrey and Grayson quickly develop a very close relationship, and this is around the time where Jeffrey had begun being called Maniac, as I forgot to mention earlier that he actually performed many freakishly athletic abilities, such as picking off a pass from James hands down with only one hand, as well as hitting home runs off the feared Little League pitcher John McNabb easily, which later earned him the moniker Maniac, as he was crazy at what he did. So further on in the second part, once Maniac had developed this relationship with Grayson, the two begin almost conversing in a conversation about education in their home lives, and they talk about racism and injustices and how they each had essentially a less fortunate growing up, where the parents were not involved in them growing up. Therefore, they talked about having to do everything themselves. So later on, once they become closer as friends, Grayson decides to move in with Maniac in the baseball equipment room at the baseball diamonds within the park, or the zoo. Once this happens, Maniac couldn't be more happy, because Grayson is the second example that he finds of a true family member, almost like a father figure for him in this situation, that offers him guidance and supplies that needed perspective in his life. Through telling him stories and essentially them living together, they develop this bond. And eventually, Maniac learns that Grayson doesn't know how to read. So in exchange for Grayson telling Maniac all kinds of stories about his life, Maniac teaches Grayson how to properly read. What happens next is kind of sad, though, in my opinion, because one day Maniac wakes up, and normally Grayson would have turned on the space heater already, and Maniac goes over to Grayson and realized that Grayson had passed away in his sleep. It's a very emotional part of the book, as Maniac had created such a close connection with Grayson, and they were such good of friends, as they each offered a aspect of support that the other couldn't supply. And it was just very sad seeing this situation unfold, and Maniac sinking into despair and ultimately leaving the park and setting out to clear his head and think of his thoughts as he basically prepared to give up on his journey to try and find a family. Further on now, in the third portion of our book, we find Jeffrey, or Maniac, in a small cabin outside of Two Mills. As he's going to bed, he starts to hear voices but doesn't really think much of it. So he goes to bed like normal, wakes up in the morning, and he's interested or intrigued or almost shocked to find two small boys sleeping in another cabin next to his. He approaches the boys and asks them what they're doing, and they say they're running away to Mexico, which in my opinion was absurd, it was kind of a moment of comedy within the book. And we truly got to see how Maniac reacted with smaller children as he tried to reason with these kids. And he even offered them a large pizza if they would return back to town with him, which they reluctantly accepted. And the three of them then headed back to Two Mills to bring the boys back to their home. So after the boys had indulged on their pizza, Maniac found out that the two brothers were none other than the siblings of John McNabb, the same Little League pitcher who Maniac had hit the home runs off of. Originally, there was bad blood between Maniac and John, but after a while, the two settled down, and John thanked Maniac for bringing his brothers back to town by letting him stay with their family. When Maniac arrived at the house, he saw something he had never seen before. He saw bottles all over the floor, animal feces, holes in the walls, holes in the ceilings, and just a chaotic mess of a situation. And it was just something that shocked Maniac because he had never seen something like that before. But it kind of taught him that even though the opinion in that era was that whites had more power over the blacks, he had seen that the way of living in the black neighborhood was nothing compared to the way of living in the white neighborhood, and that there was more carelessness among the whites than there was among the blacks. Regardless, Maniac continues to live with the McNabbs for a while, and he represents a role model for the two young boys, helping them find their way to school, helping them perform chores around the house that they would have never done normally, and also keeping them from running away again, which apparently they frequently did. All in all, in the end, or towards the end, Maniac decides to surprise the family by bringing a black boy with him to one of the McNabb's birthday parties. The original scene for this was very shocking to me, as the family didn't seem to accept that he had brought this person into their house. And what was even more horrifying next was the fact that the young boys decided to play a game that was blacks against whites, almost a Cowboys versus Indians type of game, which is racist in itself. But it was about the whites shooting the blacks in front of a black man, which was a very racist comment, and concluding to the segregation that happened in that time, because these boys didn't realize they were doing anything wrong, because they didn't realize that segregation was bad, because they were taught that it was a normal thing in their time. So further on down the road, Maniac leaves the McNabbs after not being able to handle the situation, and then begins sleeping in the buffalo pen again at the zoo. Exhausted from his last months in Two Mills, dealing with first his situation where having to leave the Beals to keep them safe, second the death of Grayson, his best friend, and third the dysfunctional family that was represented by the McNabbs, he finally decides that he's just going to live in the buffalo pen for a while and then find another place to live. It's interesting what happens next because I never would have expected it. Out of nowhere, in the middle of the night, Maniac's woken up by Amanda Beale. And Amanda starts yelling at Maniac, saying that he's going to come home. And this marks the end of the book, as Amanda says that Maniac belongs at home. And she thinks that no matter what people say, no matter what people do, Maniac belongs with them. Even though he's a white boy living in a black community, the effect he has within that community and within that family is much greater than any negative effect the community could have on that family as a result of him staying there. In conclusion, I just wanted to touch on the fact that I think Maniac is an unbelievable example of integrity. And I love the plot that in the sequence of events that happened that left the readers almost speechless throughout the novel. All in all, I really enjoyed this book, and I loved seeing how the main character in Maniac developed throughout the sequence of events, and how he evolved as a character into a role model and a more mature, adult-like character that cared for everyone and offered kindness for everyone, where he had nothing to give, but he gave everything he had. In conclusion, it was an amazing book. I had a very fun time reading it. I really loved how it panned out to be, and I really enjoyed making this podcast. So I hope you enjoyed listening, and that will be all for tonight, folks. Have a great night, and see you tomorrow.